What comes to mind when I say the word immigration? Perhaps you think of an immigrant family living in your town who left everything they knew to make a better life for themselves and for their family. Or perhaps you hear the chant, "Build that wall and make Mexico pay for it." Or perhaps the heartbreaking images of the bodies of young children washing ashore a failed escape from a war-torn country. Immigration and the related but different topic of the refugee crisis remain one of the most polarizing issues in our country today, especially coming off the 2016 election. And there doesn't seem to be much middle ground in the opinion between those who want to actually build a physical wall and deport all undocumented immigrants and those who wish to do away with any and all restrictions on immigration. Well, this issue may manifest itself differently around the country, and we'll talk about later how my experience in Lancaster is probably quite different than what some of you experience in Arizona. It does impact all of our schools. And the Supreme Court has actually even weighed in on the matter, emphasizing that public schools cannot deny access to undocumented students. So, as teachers and teacher educators, whether we want to confront this hotly contested issue or not, we must. As we review Chapter 7 of Change Wars and consider implications for our problems of practice, this essential question will guide our discussion. How can schools respond to a changing immigration and demographic landscape? So, as we move through this presentation, keep this essential question in mind and reflect on how your context may approach the question. Nogueira begins his discussion of immigration and schooling with providing the history of immigration in America, which gives us a really valuable foundation for the rest of the conversation. So, as you probably know, immigration has historically been a hot-button topic in America. Once a new wave comes seeking the American dream, the previous, now settled wave of immigrants protests in fear of losing their now established ways of life. So from the early English, Spanish, and French settlers to Africans who immigrated unwillingly through slavery, to the Irish, German, Jewish, Italians, and so on, each wave of immigration has brought a different set of issues and unique challenges. So a variety of clashes occurred with controversies around religious or political backgrounds, to concerns in the job market, to different perceived threats to national security, such as communicable diseases or, as we experience today, radical Islam. And so immigration has historically been a topic that inspires much spirited debate. So some people have argued that this new immigration is somehow different than previous waves of immigration. And that's not a new argument. We've heard this before with previous waves of immigration. However, Nogueira explains that we have to understand there are certain push factors and certain pull factors that bring immigrants here to the United States, particularly in this wave of immigration that we're experiencing today. And so he explains that this push factor comes from the widespread instability, unemployment, poverty that we see in Latin America and in Mexico. The pull factor is just the availability, it comes from other reasons, but the availability of cheap labor, types of employment, and reunification of families that have kind of come one or two members at a time. So they're reunifying with each other, and as well word-of-mouth depictions of the opportunity that exists here in America. So that's kind of pulling immigrants here. So in Chapter 7, Nogueira argues that since we don't often see these push and pull factors emerge in the national discussion on immigration, he thinks there's probably something a bit more sinister under the surface, and that's racial reasons for protesting the immigrants. And so two factors in particular I think are really important that Nogueira points out for how this impacts the schools. So historically, immigration mostly took place on the cities on the east and west coasts. However, in this wave of immigration, it's really kind of spread throughout the U.S. So many of these kind of small towns throughout the country, particularly in the Midwest, who have not really faced this issue on a kind of a local scenario, they're now seeing these immigrants in their towns. And so white communities, predominantly white communities, previously untouched by this kind of immigration, may immediately react to the shifting demographic. And so we often see that in rural America, and minorities in urban environments may also resist on racial terms given this this entry of somebody else who's looking for an already limited job and community services market. So there's perceived competition on either side, and it's just more visible to more people than it was before since they're spread out. This also means that all of our schools are impacted by this because it's happening all over the country, not just on the east and west coasts. Nogueira turns the conversation to the role schools play. He explains, public schools will continue to serve as the primary institutions of socialization and support for the immigrant children today. One of the first focuses schools can consider is that of acculturization. These students find themselves as some sort of third culture, not American and not quite of their country of origin. They find themselves at great disadvantages in adapting to our classrooms. Many of these students lack formalized education, so entry into our classrooms often comes as a culture shock. They're expected to know certain classroom behaviors and learn academic English as they are attempting to learn the language conversationally. These challenges overwhelm them, and often without appropriate support, many of these students end up rarely attending school, dropping out, or worse yet, finding their new culture and belonging in criminal and gang-related activity. In his ethnographic study entitled Making Difference Matter, Teaching and Learning in Desegregated Classrooms, Nogueira found that while it is difficult enough for these students to adapt to the official curriculum of their new school, there's also this entire set of unspoken expectations and cultural norms which these students may miss. Often, this gap in behaviors or learned skills is just written off as an intelligence issue. So to address this concern, in this study, Nogueira calls for schools to lead extracurricular activities and hire teachers and staff who care enough to invest in these children. And those relationships, through those caring faculty, can bear fruit in the classroom. Nogueira also recommends that teachers spend time reflecting on and analyzing specific classroom practices which may prioritize some students as experts over others just because of their familiarity with some of the subtle, unspoken norms of the classroom. And so a good example of this would be group projects or in class discussions. And so while those things can often be used to incorporate these students, they can also alienate them. Additionally, relationships and friendships extending outside the classroom with these teachers become excellent avenues for job recommendations or for other community services that these students may need to have access to. So it's a bridge to areas outside of academics as well. Another concern that often arises, and one that I've often experienced myself when I was a high school teacher, is that as families move, they're often forced to separate for really long periods of time. And so to maintain relationships with these other family members, the students may be sent back to their country of origin for extended periods of time. And that can most certainly interrupt your academic year. And so Nogueira calls for flexibility and adaptation in schools to help these students maintain those friendships and their academic community. And so he actually points to a couple of schools in California and Texas who've gone so far as to modify their actual academic calendar because they recognize regular patterns in students leaving for part of the academic year. And in a piece of advice quite apt for my own setting today, he also explains that teacher educators can work with teacher candidates to identify ways social boundaries are perpetuated in their own classrooms. I think it's a really helpful piece of advice. Another approach and reaction we've seen as schools seek to deal with this issue of immigration that draws on the work of John Dewey and more recently Yuri Bronfenbrenner is that of what we call a community school approach. And so this is more of a holistic approach that draws in nonprofits, schools, health and community services, all to meet the many needs that these students are going to have. And so these school facilities then become kind of a collecting point for all the services that students may need. And so there are even a number of schools who actually employ social workers on campus as a bridge between these services these students need. And so the thing is, while it's a really promising approach, there aren't many schools like this because they really require resources. They require really a special faculty who's really hardworking and creative and willing to tackle these difficult problems. And it's really kind of an interesting, wicked solution to what's certainly a wicked problem. Nogueira had a case study I found really fascinating along these lines. The case study was called Supported and Unsafe. And they dealt with one specific high school. It was a mixed method study on one high school who decided to separate out all of their English second language students on their own floor. and they had specialized scheduling and curriculum, and they tended to attract the more innovative teachers because they believed these students needed better education. And so very well intentioned, but it had a profoundly negative effect on the rest of the campus. In fact, the study found this isolation of this group likely proved a key factor in a violent clash between African American students and these Chinese students who were on campus. And so as a result, Noguera and his colleagues highly recommended that efforts to provide specialized types of treatment to immigrants without considering the impact on broader school culture should really be avoided. And they recommended efforts to integrate different student groups through extracurricular activities. As we look to the future, I do believe there's hope. Previous generations of immigrants who were racially abused and thought of as inferior now form a core of Americans whose identity nobody questions. However, low-income migrant workers do lack upward mobility in the economy due to the educational gap. They don't really steal American jobs in the way it's often assumed because they lack the widespread education that is taken for granted by many. So they find themselves working these low-skilled jobs most often. These students who come in also often face schools that continue to be segregated, continue to be overcrowded, and continue to be underfunded. So Noguera concludes his chapter by stating that theoretically, education should serve as the means for immigrant children to escape poverty. However, I believe his inclusion of the word should indicates unrealized potential. It's a call to action for you and I as educators to creatively address these challenges related to immigration. So I want to take a moment and just pause, and you can pause your video if you like, to reflect on these two questions. First, how does immigration impact education in your context? And second, how does Noguera's advice encourage or concern you as you think of your school's handling of this immigration issue? So, keeping in mind the essential question of how can schools respond to a changing immigration and demographic landscape, I need to speak of my local context and how we are experiencing immigration. So, I do believe the immigration situation is very different than what we think of when we think of the refugee crisis. But here in Lancaster, our schools and context is far more impacted by refugees than by immigrants. Lancaster, Pennsylvania is the unofficial refugee capital of the United States, taking in 20 times more refugees per capita than the rest of the country. So I'm proud to, I guess, wear that label here, and you can kind of see Lancaster in the background. More than just Amish country, but we've got tons and tons of refugees and services for refugees as well. So we really focus on resettlement as well. Our students on our campus regularly perform internships with nonprofits that seek to provide asylum, housing, different benefits, and education for refugees in this county. Some course assignments that our professors give actually require students to perform tasks like driving a refugee to the doctor or to driving their kids to the school, giving them a service of some sort. And along these lines, one of our most popular undergraduate programs at the moment is social work. And they spend a lot of their time getting their students out in the field. In my area of influence, we're particularly seeing some immigrants, typically middle-aged and most often from Central and West Africa, in our accelerated undergraduate online program. And they're seeking this education to get better jobs. Actually, in the current online course I'm teaching, I have a husband and wife as students who are former refugees from Rwanda, and they actually came in during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And now they're back, and they help refugees come here as part of their work. I have a couple of immigrants from West Africa as well in my course, and although they live here locally, and they represent some of those immigrants who've come that we're experiencing here in Lancaster. So I want to take a moment to talk about how I'm trying to address this issue in my context. And here's the building I work in. But one way I'm seeking to address the shift in demographics is to train our faculty to support all of their students, particularly to make meaningful relational connections and then appropriate connections to services like our writing center, even though they may be scattered across the country if they're an online student. And so this also includes coaching faculty to give meaningful feedback or feed forward on assessments in ways that don't punish the English language learners' language gaps. This approach would somewhat speak to the notion that Nogueira raises concerning the community schools and extracurricular opportunities to build relationships. So we're trying to build those networks outside of class as well, which can be a little challenging in the online format, but we have seen some success, particularly with our different student services. In both Change Wars and his study Making Difference Matter, Nogueira recommends that faculty collaborate and reflect together to share ideas, strategies that are working for them, and concerns they might have. One key takeaway is that I could form a faculty learning community around this issue that would research the topic specific to our context over time. In Change Wars, Nogueira also explains that immigrants have rarely received formal training. So as I design new online courses, I need to consider more advanced use of student weekly guides that would prompt better time management and learning management skills, help them learn to regulate their own learning, as well as creating opportunities for reflection on their own personal growth. A further step I am planning to explore is to connect with the nonprofits my school already works with. There's one in the area that has been the center for bringing a lot of refugees to the county that actually has a whole computer lab just dedicated to teaching refugees how to use a computer. And so my concern is there a need for online education? Are refugees and immigrants seeking out this type of education because it's more accessible? Because it certainly gives you the flexibility to hold a job and keep getting that schooling, but I'm not sure how feasible financially or even technologically it is for the typical immigrant or refugee in our area. So that's something I want to learn more about. So I'll also be applying Nogueira to Richard Thomas's problem of practice. It just kind of made sense to work with his focus on both teacher-peer and teacher-student relationships and using culturally responsive teaching to address different behavioral or even academic concerns for Latino boys. So I'll take a moment just to recap what he's doing. He's going to hold teacher training on culturally responsive training, and then have ongoing opportunities for teachers to share ideas, successes, concerns. And additionally, he's going to pair students intentionally, which I thought was a fantastic approach, pairing high and low together. And students are going to be taking this special history extension class that would cover relevant cultural topics, allowing for a more positive self-image and opportunity for students to grow in both soft and hard academic and leadership skills. Applying Richard's problem of practice to Nogueira was quite easy since he's done such a great job in designing a quality innovation strategy. In Change Wars, Nogueira recommends that schools hire caring, invested teachers, and that there's opportunities for these extracurricular activities to provide for building relationships. And given that this extra history class is provided for kind of an extended period, his innovation plays well into this advice and already speaks to his care and investment for the students. Additionally, the participating teachers that are working through this culturally responsive teaching get to grow in that area of engagement and care for these students as they continually meet. Additionally, Nogueira's ethnographic study, Making Difference Matter, directly calls for teachers to reflect with colleagues. And so Richard's already incorporated that. It's pretty fantastic. According to this particular study, these teachers should move past reflection and then together collaborate on creating lesson plans which avoid the continuation of harmful social boundaries. So that's one thing to perhaps look for as you move forward, Richard. Finally, Nogueira's case study, Supported and Unsafe, raises some rather pointed cautions. So I thought these are helpful to share. So it'd be interesting to see in your context, Richard, what impact the specialized treatment for these boys has on the broader school community. So something to look for. So let's revisit our essential question. How can schools respond to a changing immigration and demographic landscape? Here are some of the things I think we came up with during this presentation. Build extracurricular relationships. Help students adapt. Be flexible to meet student needs. Faculty development. And finally, considering the impact on broader school culture. So I'd like to end with kind of a bit of homework for you, as I often do with my students. Identify one takeaway for your context, and then share it with a coworker or colleague. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I look forward to interacting with you on this topic.